When Paper Mario released, it not only delivered a fun, light-hearted role-playing game supported by a very simplistic approach, it also set the stage for all the other Mario-themed RPGs to follow. That's probably why Paper Mario still holds up incredibly well. Offering up a fun and refreshing take on the long-standing narrative of Mario games, Paper Mario manages to deliver a robust RPG experience that caters to veterans and newcomers alike. Grinding is non-existent, as enemies are always kept relatively on par with you as you progress, eliminating the mind-numbing tedium of spending a few hours leveling up just for a single fight before having to repeat the process. Purging the usual necessity of leveling is an especially beneficial factor, as newcomers are then able to constantly move forward with little fear of being underprepared for what's ahead. Battles play out in a turn-based manner, rather than being asked to select actions from a menu. You're given button prompts that either increase the amount of damage dealt or the general effectiveness of the ability being used. Prompts range from timed button presses and holding back the analog stick for a short period of time to pressing button prompts in a certain sequence. The prompts are very easy to execute and add a nice layer of interactivity to the combat that's not usually present in these types of systems. Now, there is a striking difference in the graphical department between Paper Mario and its 16-bit predecessor. Paper Mario chooses an unusual technique of having 2D paper-thin characters roaming around in fully 3D environments, and the effect is stunning. Simply turning Mario from facing left to right results in him flipping over. The idea is a clever one, and carried out beautifully by intelligent systems. There are 3D aspects included as well though. All of these elements add up to a seriously good-looking game, which has managed to stand the test of time thanks to its unique presentation. Force Gemini is an epic story of twin space rangers fighting against an evil tyranny, but when the evil tyrant Majora rears his ugly insect head, the entire Jet Force is crushed when faced against overwhelming power. Now only Juno, Vela and Lupus are left in this wake of destruction, and it's down to them to turn everything around. The gameplay itself revolves heavily around combat and exploration, and both these aspects of the game work very well indeed. But not everything is about the bloodshed. In true Rare style, Force Gemini comes packed with all sorts of pickups and items to find. Sometimes you have to explore every nook and cranny of the massive levels to find a certain weapon, door key or item to progress. Unfortunately, this need for exploration is dramatically emphasized in the latter half of the game. Instead of making the item collecting a minor task, the game requires you to track down nearly every single item in the galaxy. But the main redeeming factor of the game has to be its presentation. Maybe the game designers felt that the Nintendo 64 had to go out with a bang. Whatever the reason, Force Gemini has some of the best visuals the console has to offer. While some levels are mainly just corridors, several are absolutely huge rooms with no fog, no pop-up and no slowdown at all. The character models look great as well, with plenty of detail, while the explosions you'll frequently see in the game look pretty damn fine as well. As far as the frame rate goes, it is solid. There's a bit of slowdown when the screen is literally filled with hostile drones, but it doesn't hurt the overall impression. If there was ever a game to show off the N64's graphical capabilities, Force Gemini should take the credit. It might be an old game now, but it's still well worth searching out for N64 owners who missed it when it came out. F-Zero X was the long-awaited follow-up to the Super Nintendo original. It managed to maintain nearly every aspect that made the series so great in the first place, all the while making the transition to 3D with ease. It plays a lot like its predecessor, picking up the same concept of futuristic vehicles driving at incredible speeds over all kinds of interesting and unique tracks, all the while adding some new aspects and far more options to the tried and tested formula. This time around you had to face up to 30 opponents during each race, making the game an even more intense and challenging experience than its predecessor, mainly due to the good AI of the enemy pilots. The racetracks themselves have also seen a complete makeover. Even if some of them resemble their counterparts from the first game, there are now some new challenges such as loops, slopes or tunnels, making the tracks more demanding at times and far more fascinating to drive on. Graphically, F-Zero X might seem rather underwhelming and not really spectacular at first, with its mediocre backgrounds and the so-so vehicle models. models, not exactly making use of the full power of the N64, but you'll notice quickly that it made perfect sense for Nintendo to stay away from all too fancy 3D visuals. By keeping the racetracks rather simplistic, Nintendo was able to maintain the incredible sense of speed in F-Zero X, with virtually no frame drop to be found in the entire game whatsoever. Even when there's up to 30 vehicles on the same track, the frame rate always remains constant and high. And considering how fast this title is, that's a real accomplishment for Nintendo. But then again, it's not really that tragic that there aren't that many details on the tracks or the vehicles. You wouldn't actually care to notice them anyway, since you have to focus on the speed and the controls instead. If you own a Nintendo 64 and you're a fan of racing, F-Zero X is an absolute must. Its fast-paced, futuristic action will always manage to capture the attention of anyone who plays it, as well as provide many hours of fun. Star Wars Rogue Squadron packs a serious punch when it comes to showing what the N64 was capable of. While the previous game, Shadows of the Empire, offered on-foot missions as well as some spacecraft-based levels, developer Factor 5 decided to stick to vehicle missions only, and that was definitely a wise choice. The entire game is split up into several flight and fight missions that put you into the role of Luke Skywalker as the leader of the Rogue Squadron. Before each mission, you can choose the vehicle you are going to use, with the possible choices being the ever so popular X-Wing, A-Wing, Y-Wing, Snowspeeder, and later on the V-Wing. Naturally, there are some unlockable ships as well, with the most obvious being the Millennium Falcon, among several others, but I don't want to spoil anything. But on to the subject of this video. There really isn't a lot to complain about the visuals in Rogue Squadron. For a Nintendo 64 game, Factor 5 simply did an outstanding job. The entire look of the game, including the ships and environments, are extremely polished and offer a faithful recreation of a galaxy far, far away. Nevertheless, I also have to mention two unfortunate flaws Factor 5 was unable to get rid of before the original release. Since we're talking about a Nintendo 64 game, I think you can already imagine what the most striking problem might be. Yes, fog. Like in so many other games on the N64, a lot of the backgrounds take some time to build up properly, resulting in the infamous fog effect. Sure, it's not really a big deal, but in a game like this, it would be nice to be able to look further into the backgrounds, in order to see some enemy fighters that bit sooner. All in all, the graphics are excellent to say the least, and are bound to please any Star Wars fan. Conker's Bad Fur Day is quite easily one of the most unique and unexpected games to hit the Nintendo 64. What is easily the game's most defining feature is the blatantly mature content throughout. Rare took a huge risk with Conker's raunchy comedy, especially on a system known for its mostly child-friendly games. Conker himself is a cursing, alcohol-loving squirrel. He manages to get mixed up with an evil king, who just so happens to be looking for a squirrel on the orders of his doctor. Of course, Conker is oblivious to this fact, and has to travel through many strange places filled with a lovable cast of NPCs that bring a real weight to the world you inhabit. Rare pulled every graphical trick out of the book for Conker's Bad Fur Day, from the incredible multicolored real-time lighting that illuminates each area to the real-time shadow that mocks Conker's every step. Rare's final Nintendo 64 game is the console's most visually impressive, with fully animated character faces, with limitless facial expressions accurately conveying their feelings on the fly. Whether Conker's determined, sad or angry, you'll know exactly how he's feeling. And to match this, the levels are enormous and never suffer from popping. While the texture work is admittedly mediocre in the early areas, it gradually improves as you keep playing. Conker's Bad Fur Day pushes the Nintendo 64 to its graphical limit, and this becomes painfully obvious when the frame rate slows down while you enter outdoor areas. But it's nothing that truly takes away from the experience as a whole. To put it simply, Conker's Bad Fur Day is the reason to own a Nintendo 64. It has a hilarious and great single player mode, whose only downfall is its lack of replay value. If you never got around to playing it back in the day, there's no better time than now. The Mario Kart series has no doubt become as popular as the main Mario series itself. The reason why is because there's a few key qualities that they all share: simplicity and multiplayer mayhem at heart. Not only does Mario Kart 64 have both of these, it has them in abundance. It sees you driving around various racetracks simply trying to finish in first, and this alone would be fun enough, but then the tracks are littered with item boxes, and there are plenty of items. You can shoot Koopa shells, some that just bounce around the track forever if they miss, some that home in on their target, and some that hit the racer in first place, destroying anyone in its path. Now there are only 16 tracks which are divided into 4 different cups, but somehow none of them get tedious. Now when it comes to visuals, Mario Kart 64 is rather impressive for one of the earlier games to release on the system. It runs reasonably well in terms of technical performance, pretty much maintaining a smooth and consistent frame rate with just 1 or 2 players. When played with 3 players or more though, it's noticeable that the game struggles on certain tracks, and as a result the game speed is altered to make up for this. It's far from an ideal solution, but unless you're super picky about frames, it shouldn't be enough of an issue to stop you from playing. Everything fans loved in the first game is now painted with a more detailed brush. Characters have definitely improved with great color depth and plenty frames of animation. They're larger too, though the blurriness people remember from Nintendo 64 games shows its face occasionally, and some textures seem more simplistic than perhaps they should, but there's never really a moment where the game feels incredibly dated. If you're on the lookout for some multiplayer mayhem on the Nintendo 64, Mario Kart is a solid option. With the release of the N64, many series which have been popular on previous systems were in for a 3D change. Many made the transition very well, showing that it could be just as fun with an extra dimension, but some had more difficulty with the transition and didn't end up being nearly as fun in the process. But just because the new system offered the possibility of 3D, and that's what many of the games chose to do, it didn't mean every game would walk this path, and this is where Kirby 64 comes into play. It takes on a 2.5D style, which means that although the scenery and surroundings and almost everything had a 3D look to it, the actual play of the game took place on a purely 2D path. There are 6 worlds to visit and complete to beat the game. 7 if you get all of the crystals from each of the different stages in the worlds. In each of them you have to collect 3 crystal shards, and some are pretty easy to find. Others are very well hidden or need a certain ability or a combination to find. Now graphically, Kirby 64 has a nice, smooth appearance. The characters are well modelled, and the animation is extremely well done, lending the characters a very lifelike feel. The entire game is extremely colourful, and it really jumps off the screen at you. The only real knockback against Kirby 64 is that it isn't exactly a long game. Even if you're trying to collect every single crystal shard, the game can be completed in a very short time. While some might initially be put off by the youthful nature of Kirby 64, the depth of the combo system really brings a lot to what would otherwise be an average platformer. Nintendo 64 owners should definitely give this one a go. Majora's Mask is an action-adventure game featuring the typical Zelda mix of exploration, fighting, puzzle solving, and helping out NPCs. In some ways, Majora's Mask is quite similar to Ocarina of Time. It's got the same superb controls, so anyone who has ever played Ocarina of Time will immediately feel right at home. But what helps it differentiate itself from the previous entry is the introduction of masks, which provide the player an incredible amount of ways to interact with the game. There are 24 masks in total, and all of them are needed to complete a specific portion of the game, most primarily the side quests. Now there's no denying that the game is a bit of a looker. On a purely technical level, it's a noticeable step up from Ocarina of Time, and offers, by Nintendo 64 standards, stunning draw distances, tons of details, fluid animations, and great looking characters, enemies, and bosses. Some other things are also worth mentioning, one being how Majora's Mask is capable of offering up a lot more enemies on the screen at any one time, which makes for some very challenging fights and showdowns. The faces of the various characters are also impressively expressive, being able to convey a wide array of emotions. Some neat visual effects don the game as well. Every day and night in Majora's Mask lasts so much longer than in Ocarina of Time, also gives you the chance to enjoy the locations under so many different kinds of lighting, further showcasing the richness and nuances of the game's visual experience. This deep, challenging game promises to capture your imagination and attention for hours at a time. It stands as a true must-have for the system and Zelda fans alike. It all started with the release of Resident Evil in 1996. It was one of the first games of its kind and a genuinely frightening adventure. Despite the rather B-movie voice acting, the game itself and the story was very good, which would continue on with a sequel and leave behind the dark and moody mansion of the first game for the far more populated Raccoon City. If you've ever played any of the previous Resident Evil games, then you'll know exactly what to expect. It has the same basic gameplay as the first game, except with a couple of new twists. It really took the best of the first and made it even better. Solving puzzles and blowing the heads off zombies had never been more satisfying. But here's where the visuals come into focus, which seem to have improved drastically over its predecessor, as the pre-rendered backgrounds set new standards for the series. For example, as you make your way through the slum of Raccoon City to the police station, you'll pass through alleys cluttered with garbage, basketball courts covered in graffiti, cars burning and crows picking at the dead. Even the zombies are much improved. They aren't just guys in lab coats anymore. Most of the zombies you face will be police officers, but some are dressed like janitors, lawyers, or anybody else you might find dwelling in the police station. And to top it off, they all look fantastic. Leon pumps his arms realistically when he runs, and Claire's ponytail bounces as she jogs along. They don't have a ton of animation, but they excel with the ones they have. This game dumped the live acting of the original and made its move into CG, and this is very impressive, especially considering that it's running on the N64, which was never really known for it due to the limitations of cartridges. If you're a long-time fan of the series or are just getting into Resident Evil now, going back and playing the original Resident Evil 2 is something that I cannot recommend enough. As a spiritual successor to Rare's developed GoldenEye 007, Perfect Dark succeeds in many ways in surpassing a legendary title and making a legend for itself. You take up the role of Joanna Dark, a highly trained but inexperienced operative for the peace-loving Carrington Institute. This sees the game being split up into a series of levels that build upon the excellence set by GoldenEye, with multiple objectives being presented on 3 varying difficulties. Unlike a lot of cheap difficulty methods though, even on the hardest difficulty, enemies still require the same amount of hits on them to drop, but you still get a challenge as damage is increased against you. If there was ever a game to look to as an example of what the Nintendo 64 is capable of, Perfect Dark is the perfect choice. Lush, detailed and perfectly rendered 3D levels, sharp and clean textures, fluid and realistic animations, and some of the most impressive dynamic lighting you'll ever see on the console. There is a great contrast between dark and light from a gameplay perspective. Rooms become darker if lights are destroyed, while gunfire illuminates them. One level features great lightning and rain effects, adding an interesting atmosphere to the game, whereas large areas have no distance fog, allowing you to strategically aim your sniper rifle. Admittedly, the frame rate can drop in some places, but it's nowhere near as bad as some people make it out to be. Granted, in some of the multiplayer modes, the frame rate can drop significantly, especially if they include many players and a large number of computer-controlled bots. But for the most part, Perfect Dark has a solid frame rate for a Nintendo 64 game. Well, that does it for today's video. Keep an eye out for part 2 as that will be coming up soon, so don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell to get notified about new videos. You can follow me on all of the socials to stay up to date, and also join my growing community on Discord to meet many like-minded gamers to continue the conversation with. I'd like to give a special shout out to my Patreon supporters: Rhino, Skill Jim, Nano, Steve, Richard, Amy, Daniel, Paul, Dio, Alex, Pierre, Carl, Strider and Paddy J for their continued support that helps make these videos possible. If you're interested in joining my Discord or supporting my channel through Patreon, you'll find all of these links in the description. As always, thanks for taking the time to watch the video. I'll catch you next time.